how I learned to code and got a job in this industry. So in the beginning, I want to share a segment from a podcast that I was watching very recently. Guys in the podcast talked about very important concept on how to break down tasks and how to see a problem from all angles. And I've never heard anyone explaining that before. Through my experience in software development, I learned this approach, and I've been practicing this approach my whole career while I'm building tasks, building features, and trying to work through complex situations. I've always used this framework and kind of throughout the years realized that this is the right approach, this is the only approach that I can follow. But I never attempted to put that framework into words. And I was listening to this podcast and I realized, okay, this is exactly what I'm doing. So I wanted to share that with you. And I'm going to jump into that in a second. Then after the podcast section, I'm going to talk about how this is the key part for you to learn to get a job as a software developer. Nothing else really matters. I could share with you here code examples. I could give you everything that you need. But the key concept behind all of that is how to think and how to break down complex situations. So yeah, let's jump into the podcast and I'm going to share my framework with you at the end of this video.
So trying to understand how to think through a problem well, which we are all faced with, you have two options. Put your head down, you will be used as a pawn. Pick your head up, pay attention, you can hopefully navigate this well. What I hear you saying is you have to accurately map out what is really happening. Getting an understanding of what is actually happening, or an accurate assessment of the players, the pieces is how I typically refer to it. Is that where you're going? Like you just have to really map the terrain?
Yeah, well, that's where I'm starting from. The starting point is to understand that emotional decision-making is what the human brain wants to do. It wants to make emotional decisions because emotional decisions require less cognitive ability, less calories, less time. It's so much easier to just fall back on what you were conditioned as a kid to believe, what you have experienced as an adult, what your opinions are, what your friends say. It's just the easiest, fastest way to make a decision. The brain is inherently very conservative of its energy. We often joke that the brain is lazy. So the brain just jumps to conclusions. And when you give it a way of jumping to a conclusion, it likes that. It's like muscle memory.
And this is exactly what happens when you are new to coding and you start to code and you get a grasp of understanding how to write your first code, how to write some if statements, how to write some for loops. And then you start to move forward fast, thinking that you're going to move forward faster if you're going to do like fast, quick decisions. This is good in some cases, but you have to understand that your fast thinking is the emotional thinking. And whenever you make decisions emotionally, you usually make mistakes. And it's okay to be emotionally driven because you're a human. But if you've never been into software development, the coding comes to you so hard just because you've never tried to slowly think and make smart, rational decisions in a controllable, slow way. Because you're used to do things fast because of the social media, of everything else around in the world going on. Everything is so fast. But in software development, to actually do it properly, to write proper code that doesn't break, you have to stop, slow down, and kind of try to think from all angles and approach each problem with a careful, smart approach. And by the way, this is not something that I came up with. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow that explains fast and slow thinking. There's science behind all of that. Even with this video, with this simple video, you should already be slightly aware of how you are thinking and how you are making your decisions. Are you thinking fast in an emotional way, or are you thinking slow and in a smart, rational way? You should already notice the difference in yourself, and you need to catch yourself in these moments when you start to think fast and when you start to think emotionally. And the biggest problem is that your brain loves this fast thinking approach because it saves a lot of time for you.
Brain loves that because it saves all this analysis and contextualizing and synthesis and information vetting. It saves itself all that trouble by just jumping to a conclusion. So you see information is presented to you in what form? In a way that triggers an emotional response. even to your point about the whole, like, Palestine and Hamas are presented in a way where it's hard to distinguish the difference between the two. I completely agree. The reason they are presented that way is to make it easy for the human brain in the target audience to leap to the conclusion that Palestine is Hamas. Hamas is Palestine. They are the same, which makes everything happening in Israel right now under the rubric of terrorism. If that's the narrative you want to portray, it's easy to get there when you don't differentiate, when you don't use subtlety and nuance to explain your information. As soon as you start to dig into the information, as soon as you start to map the battlefield, you start to see all the changes in the terrain. You start to see the tree line. You start to see the sand pits. You start to see the areas that are high ground and highest ground, and how they're different from the low ground and the lowest ground, right? So it takes that level of awareness to be able to really land on a meaningful decision. So the first thing to understand is that we decide, you, me, the smartest people, the dumbest people, it's irrelevant of your race, age, creed, or education level. We all, pink matter, brain matter, decide first and easily through emotions, through an emotional lens. It's sometimes called emotional reasoning. Emotion and reasoning are two different things. But when you reason through a lens of emotion, it's a cognitive distortion that we call emotional reasoning. Understanding that is kind of the first step.
So let's relate back this point to software development. How is this relevant to Python and learning Python and becoming a software developer? Everything that you're seeing online is usually these simple topics. Learning the basics, the syntax, variables, data structures, etc., etc., etc. All of this, like, these are all simple topics that you can find online. You can find the documentation page. You can learn them quickly and easily. But the problem is, you're seeing this information online, and this is all available mostly for free, just because this is the easiest information to digest. And most people think in this emotional, simple way, and they love this kind of content, and it's easy for them to digest that. The reality of the software development is that it's not that easy. It's not just simple 8 steps and you get a job and it's all good and peachy and we live all good lives and so on and so forth. Real companies, real tech companies are difficult to navigate, and real projects deal with real complex problems. And it's never like this. It's never like step 1, step 5, whatever. It's never that easy. But it becomes easy once you learn how to digest information and how to break down things in a logical, slow way. When you look at things from all angles.
So I have a big bumper sticker that I try to get people to take in for this very reason. So I agree. You have to map the terrain. You have to understand what's actually going on. You have to distrust yourself. That's my bumper sticker.
That's a great bumper sticker.
Because you can't make decisions without emotions. Mm-hmm. So literally, if you selectively damage the area of the brain that's in charge of emotions, people can give you all the reasons why fish is better than beef. And then they still, in the end, they can't make a decision, because without the ability to process emotion, to push in one direction or another, you literally, I don't mean this like as an analogy, you literally can't make a decision without emotion. The bad news is that your emotions are influenced by your frame of reference. So everything that happened to you from the time you were a little kid, whatever, until today, like all of it creates the context that will trigger an emotion. Now, the problem is the emotion, to your point, makes the decision feel obvious. Mm-hmm. And so you context plus the whatever happens creates emotion. Emotion makes one decision obvious over the other, but that doesn't mean it's the quote unquote right decision. Okay, so you have mapped the terrain. You have understand the way the pink matter is working, that you're going to be making these decisions emotionally. What else goes into this? Remember, I'm trying to get people to your 2024 for sure is going to be brutal. If you can anchor yourself and think well through problems that you haven't seen before, you're going to do far better in life. So that is the umbrella under which I asked the question.
After you map the battlefield, I mean, to use a military parallel, after you map the battlefield, the next thing you need to do is take in all source intelligence.
And again, let's relate this back to software development. You have to first realize that you learning from coding tutorials online is not going to be enough. Reading books is just going to give you 10% of the value. I talked about this in my previous video. Yes, of course, you can find information online that will help you, but it's not going to give you enough experience to get a job and get hired as a professional. You need to practice doing, you need to build projects, you need to practice your coding skills every day. You need to build projects so that you can change your brain in a way that coding decisions become automatic. And yeah, of course, in the beginning it's difficult. These coding decisions come to you slow, in a slow way, because you've never practiced this before. Going back to this picture, at some point, if you practice enough, the slow thinking part becomes fast thinking, because you practice and it becomes automatic to you. It's no longer limited to doing things slowly, because you can practice fundamentals and how syntax and how coding principles in general work. You can practice that, and then it becomes automatic to you and it becomes fast. But to do that properly, you need to find people to learn from, and you need to practice a lot.
All source intelligence means you're accepting information from all sources.
How do you make sure you're not taking in biased sources, since every source is probably biased?
So because every source is biased, that's the assumption you have to have about every source. So the important thing is we're all accustomed to taking in certain trusted sources: mom, dad, wife, husband, sisters, brothers, coworkers, whatever it might be. Maybe your trusted source is CNN, maybe your trusted source is Fox News, maybe your trusted source is BBC, maybe your trusted source is AP. We all have our trusted sources, but those trusted sources are all biased in some way. So the only way to offset the bias is to take in information from the opposite bias.
And this is exactly what I'm talking about. What you can find usually online is not the best information, and it's not the best approach how you should build projects and how you should approach software development. It's just whatever people have put online, and most of the stuff that you can find online is just done by someone who is doing coding as a hobby, and it's not really a professional solution. So that's the pitfall for a lot of beginners. They learn from tutorials online, but you're not aware that you're getting the worst information. The best information you can learn from people who are already in the industry. Ideally, you should be working as a software developer already and just learning from experienced people above you.
Now, if you've ever been a Boy Scout, if you've ever done anything like land navigation, you can always identify where you are located by doing something called a reverse azimuth, casting a reverse azimuth. Have you ever heard of this?
What the hell is that?
So when you look on a compass and you point the compass at where you're trying to go, you're creating an azimuth, a direction. In reverse, if you're trying to find out where you are, you can find a landmark, a tall mountain, a building, a cathedral, a city, whatever else it might be. Aim your compass at the landmark, and now casting the reverse direction, you know where you are in comparison to the landmark. If you do that with two landmarks, those two landmarks have an intersection point, and now you know your true location. So a reverse azimuth in the information space means you listen to left-leaning news, but then you also listen to right-leaning news. Where they say the same thing, you have a high confidence that it's accurate. Where they say everything else doesn't necessarily mean either side is wrong. It's just starting to show you their bias. But what you have confidence in is where they agree. If you do that enough times, you start to have a foundation of truth. I know this to be true. I have high confidence that this is true because left-leaning and right-leaning news sources are saying this is happening. But then everything around it, what we would call the fog of war, everything around it is unknown. It's wrapped in fog. It hasn't been discovered yet. It hasn't been reported yet. It hasn't been stress tested or vetted yet. So it's a foggier area. It's an area of missing information. Vice your small pond or your small island of known information. And as it's difficult for most people to actually put it into practice because it slows the world down.
And basically, to put my whole system or my steps of how I learned to code and how I got a job as a software developer, if we put all of that in 4 simple points, what you need to do is you need to find your sources of information from where you can gather information that you believe is true, not just online free tutorials, but actually people you can learn from. Once you gather your sources, you want to go and find as much as possible from these sources. Talk to these people, question them, and collect that information into your own notes. Once you have information that comes from multiple sources, meaning multiple people, multiple companies where you have worked at, you can collect all of that information and you can find true coding principles. You can see what works and what doesn't work. And you practice coding throughout this whole time, all the time. You build your own projects, you practice coding, and you solidify these principles, what works, and you remove whatever doesn't work. And at some point you arrive at some kind of truthful place where you know, okay, if I do this, this works. If I do that, this works. And whatever doesn't work, you just remove that. And I've done this for years. And I've collected a lot of principles that I know just works. And I've removed everything that doesn't work from my system. And there is no way around this. You're not gonna just find a list of true coding principles online. And this idea that you're just gonna read these true coding principles, you will learn them just by reading, and that's not gonna happen. You need to practice them. You need to practice the information that you find, and you need to solidify and understand in your own mind what works and what doesn't work. Because there's a lot of information out there that doesn't work and doesn't bring you any results. I know that this whole process can be difficult to navigate and can be difficult to find people to learn from. If that's your case, you can find my contact details below this video and you can reach out to me and we can talk about how I can help you.